I still remember the smell of that morning. Salt water mixed with diesel fuel. The air was thick with anxiety, like you could reach out and grab it with your bare hands. June 6, 1944. A date they'd later carve into history books. But for us, for me, it was just another day we might not live to see the end of. My name is James Miller, Private First Class, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. 22 years old from a small town in Virginia, where the biggest excitement was the annual county fair. Before the war, I'd never even seen the ocean. Now I was about to storm across one, straight into the jaws of hell. The night before, we'd been briefed on the mission. Operation Overlord, they called it. We were part of the first wave hitting Omaha Beach. The officers tried to sound confident, told us the German defenses would be weakened by air bombardment, that we'd have naval support, that the beach would be softened up before we even touched sand. Some guys believed it. The veterans among us knew better. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did, really. We spent the dark hours checking our gear over and over, writing letters home, praying, or just staring into the distance. My buddy Frank Wilson sat next to me cleaning his rifle for what must have been the 10th time. "You scared, Miller?" he asked without looking up. "Only a fool wouldn't be," I answered. Frank nodded. "My old man fought in the Great War. Said being scared keeps you sharp. It's when you stop being scared that you're in trouble." I thought about my family back home. My mother's tearful goodbye at the train station. My father's firm handshake and the pride in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. My younger sister Emily, who'd made me promise to bring her back something from Europe. Something pretty, she'd said, to make up for all the ugly you'll see. The sea was rough that morning. The landing craft pitched and rolled in the waves, making a lot of men seasick. The vomit mixed with the seawater sloshing around our boots. The smell is something I've never forgotten. It clung to everything, your uniform, your skin, even seemed to seep into your very bones. Our sergeant, a weathered man named Harris who'd been with us since basic training, moved through the crowded craft, checking equipment and offering what encouragement he could. When he got to me, he paused. "Miller," he said, looking at me with those steel gray eyes of his. "You stick close to Wilson. Watch each other's backs." "Yes, Sergeant," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The sound of artillery grew louder as we approached the shore. The big naval guns were firing over our heads, pounding the beach defenses. The noise was deafening, but somehow not as frightening as the moments when it briefly stopped. In those pauses, you could hear men praying, cursing, some crying quietly. I wasn't particularly religious before the war. My family attended church on Sundays, but it was more routine than devotion. Yet in that landing craft, rocking violently as we approached Omaha Beach, I found myself praying more sincerely than I ever had before. The coxswain at the rear of our craft shouted over the din, "5 minutes!" Those words sent a jolt through all of us. 5 minutes until we either lived or died. 5 minutes until we faced whatever waited for us on that beach. I checked my rifle one last time, made sure my ammunition pouches were secure, adjusted my helmet. Frank looked at me and attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "See you on the beach, Miller. See you there," I replied, though a part of me wondered if either of us would make it. The craft jolted violently, and someone shouted that we'd hit a sandbar. The front ramp hadn't dropped yet, but the coxswain was yelling that we had to get out, that we were as close as we were going to get. "Over the sides! Move it!" Sergeant Harris bellowed, and then everything happened at once. The world exploded into chaos. The ramp finally dropped, and the men at the front were cut down immediately by machine gun fire. Their bodies crumpled, blocking the exit. Those of us still inside had no choice but to go over the sides as ordered. I don't remember jumping. I just remember the shock of the cold water, much deeper than anyone had told us it would be. I went under, weighed down by my equipment. Panic seized me as I fought to the surface. When my head finally broke through, I gasped for air, only to have a wave crash over me, pushing me back under. The weight of my pack was dragging me down. I fumbled with the straps, fighting to release myself from the burden that was killing me. Finally, the pack came loose, and I kicked back to the surface. I'd been trained not to abandon my equipment, but in that moment, it was either the pack or my life. Around me, men were drowning. Some had been hit by bullets before they even reached the water. Others, like me, were struggling with their gear. The water was tinged red. That's something I've never been able to forget. The sea turning red around us. I managed to make my way toward shore, keeping my rifle raised above the water. The noise was overwhelming. Explosions, gunfire, the screams of the wounded and dying, officers shouting orders that no one could hear. The beach seemed miles away, though it couldn't have been more than 100 yards. Every inch was a struggle. Bullets hit the water around me, creating tiny geysers. I kept thinking each one would find me, end me right there in the cold water of the English Channel. But somehow I made it to the shallows. My boots found sand and I began to run, crouched low toward whatever cover I could find. The beach was littered with obstacles. Steel hedgehogs designed to rip open landing craft, wooden stakes with mines attached to them. Between these and the bodies of those who had fallen before me, it was like navigating a nightmare. I found temporary shelter behind a wrecked landing craft. Several other men had the same idea. One of them was bleeding badly from a shoulder wound. Another was simply staring straight ahead, unresponsive to anything around him. Shell shock, they called it then. Anyone seen Wilson? I shouted over the noise of battle. No one had. I peered around the edge of our shelter, scanning the beach for any sign of Frank. The German positions were built into the bluffs overlooking the beach. They had clear fields of fire in every direction. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, all raining down on us as we huddled in whatever meager cover we could find. Our job was to move inland, to clear those gun positions to establish a foothold. But from where I crouched, that seemed impossible. Many of the officers who were supposed to lead us were already dead. Units were scattered, mixed together. The carefully planned assault had devolved into chaos within minutes. "We've got to move!" someone shouted. A lieutenant I didn't recognize was trying to rally the men around our position. "We stay here, we're dead. We've got to push forward." He was right. The tide was coming in. Soon our little shelter would be underwater. We had no choice but to advance or die where we stood. What followed were the most intense moments of my life. We ran in short bursts, diving for cover, firing at the German positions when we could get a clear shot. I lost track of time. Everything narrowed to the few feet around me, to the next bit of cover, to the next moment of survival. I remember seeing a tank that had made it ashore, providing crucial fire support. I remember passing a medic working frantically on a wounded soldier, both of them exposed to enemy fire. I remember the hot ping of a bullet grazing my helmet, the impact almost knocking me off my feet. And then, as we approached the seawall that ran along parts of the beach, I saw Frank. He was lying face down in the sand, not moving. I diverted from my path, running to him, dropping to my knees beside his body. "Frank!" I rolled him over, searching for signs of life. His eyes were open, staring at the sky, but there was no recognition there. Blood soaked the front of his uniform from multiple bullet wounds to his chest. "No, no, no," I muttered, shaking him as if I could wake him from a deep sleep. "Come on, buddy. We've got to move." But Frank was beyond moving, beyond everything. The reality of it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't some stranger. This was Frank Wilson, who'd shared his last cigarette with me the night before, who'd talked about the fishing boat he wanted to buy after the war, who had a girl waiting for him back in Pennsylvania. I don't know how long I knelt there. Seconds probably, though it felt like hours. The battle raged around me, but I was locked in a bubble of grief and shock. Then something hit me hard from behind, knocking me forward across Frank's body. "Move, soldier!" An officer grabbed my shoulder, pulling me up. "He's gone. Nothing you can do for him now." I stumbled to my feet, still dazed. The officer pushed me toward the seawall, and my training took over. I ran, keeping low, and joined a group of men gathering there. The seawall provided some protection, but we were still taking fire. Mortars exploded behind us, throwing sand and worse into the air. A medic moved among the wounded, doing what he could with limited supplies. "Baron, Bangalore," someone called out. They were preparing to blow a path through the barbed wire that ran along the top of the seawall. This was our chance to get off the beach, to reach the bluffs and take out those gun positions. I helped pass the explosive-laden tubes forward, my movements mechanical, my mind still partially with Frank's body abandoned on the beach. The shock of losing him hadn't fully registered yet. In a way, it was mercy. It let me function when I might otherwise have frozen. The Bangalore torpedo did its job, blasting a gap in the wire. "Go! Go! Go!" Officers and NCOs shouted, urging us through the breach. I followed the men ahead of me, scrambling up the loose soil of the bluff, using grass roots and anything else I could grab to pull myself upward. The Germans had trenches and bunkers throughout the area. As we crested the bluff, we came under fire from a position to our right. Several men fell. The rest of us hit the ground, returning fire where we could. A sergeant I didn't know organized a small group of us to flank the position. We worked our way through a shallow draw, using scrub vegetation for cover. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Each step could be my last. Each moment could bring the bullet with my name on it. We managed to get to a position where we could throw grenades into the German trench. The explosions were followed by screams. We charged in, firing at anything that moved. It was brutal, close-quarters fighting. I saw things in those moments that I've spent the rest of my life trying to forget. When it was over, the bunker was ours. Inside, we found maps showing other German positions. The sergeant ordered a runner to take the information back to whatever command structure had been established on the beach. We continued inland, linking up with other American units as we encountered them. The fighting remained fierce, but we were making progress. By late afternoon, we had pushed about a mile from the beach. Not as far as the planners had hoped, but given how the day had started, it was a miracle we'd advanced at all. Night brought a lull in the fighting. We dug in, established a defensive perimeter, attended to the wounded. I found myself in a foxhole with a kid named Peterson, barely 18, from somewhere in the Midwest. He was shaking so badly he could hardly hold his rifle. "First combat?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. He nodded. "You?" "Yeah," I said. First time. It wasn't true exactly. I'd seen brief action in North Africa, but nothing like the sustained horror of that day on Omaha Beach. Still, it seemed important to let Peterson think we were in the same boat. "I didn't think it would be like this," he said, his voice barely audible. "They never told us it would be like this." I didn't have an answer for him. Instead, I shared my K rations and what was left of my water. We sat in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts, listening to the sporadic gunfire and distant explosions that continued through the night. I must have dozed off eventually, exhaustion overcoming even the adrenaline and fear. My dreams were a chaotic jumble of images from the day. Frank's lifeless eyes, the red-tinged surf, the bodies scattered across the beach like discarded dolls. Dawn brought renewed fighting. The Germans launched a counterattack, trying to push us back to the beach. Artillery pounded our positions. We held on, though the cost was high. Men I'd spoken to just hours earlier were suddenly gone, their lives extinguished in an instant. By midday, reinforcements had arrived. More men, tanks, supplies. The beachhead was secure, and the push inland continued with fresh urgency. Our company was assigned to take a small village about 2 miles from the coast. Intelligence suggested it was lightly defended, but we learned not to trust such assessments. We advanced cautiously through fields and hedgerows. The Normandy countryside was a patchwork of small fields separated by ancient earthen berms, topped with thick hedges. They provided cover but also limited visibility, making it perfect terrain for ambushes. Peterson stayed close to me. Despite having just met, we'd formed the instant bond that combat creates. We watched each other's backs, we shared supplies, took turns on watch. His shaking had subsided, replaced by a grim determination that aged him years in a matter of hours. "If I don't make it," he said as we prepared to move out toward the village, "could you write to my mother? Tell her I wasn't afraid?" I nodded, though the request chilled me. "Same for me," I said. "My folks are in Culpeper, Virginia. But we're both going to make it, right?" He attempted a smile that didn't quite work. "Right." The approach to the village seemed eerily quiet. No resistance, no sign of the enemy. Our lieutenant signaled for extra caution, suspecting a trap. He was right to be wary. The first shots came as we reached the outskirts of the village. A German machine gun opened up from a church steeple, cutting down the point man and 2 others before anyone could react. We scattered, seeking cover wherever we could find it. I ended up behind a stone wall with Peterson and 3 other men. The machine gun had us pinned down, its fire sweeping the area regularly, keeping us from moving. One of the men with us, a corporal named Dawson, was hit in the leg as he dove for cover. Peterson and I pulled him fully behind the wall while the others provided covering fire. "We need to take out that gun," the sergeant with us said. "Otherwise, we're stuck here." There was a brief discussion of options. Finally, it was decided that 2 of us would try to work our way around to the side of the church, while the others provided distraction. I volunteered along with a private named Martinez. We used drainage ditches, outbuildings, and whatever else we could find to move without being seen. It was slow, tense work. Every sound seemed magnified. The crunch of gravel under our boots, our labored breathing, the occasional ping of a bullet hitting something nearby. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached a position behind the church. There was a small door that likely led to a staircase up to the bell tower where the machine gun was positioned. Martinez and I exchanged a look, no words needed. He would go first, I would follow. The door was unlocked. Martinez eased it open, his rifle at the ready. No response. He slipped inside and I followed close behind. The interior was dim, lit only by what little sunlight filtered through small, high windows. Dust motes danced in the beams of light. We found the stairs and began to climb, moving as quietly as possible. Each creak of the old wooden steps seemed loud enough to alert the entire German army. My mouth was dry, my palms sweaty around my rifle. Martinez moved with a grace I envied, placing each foot carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. As we neared the top, we could hear German voices. 2 of them, maybe 3, talking in low tones. Martinez looked back at me, held up 2 fingers, then 3 with a questioning look. I nodded. At least 2, possibly 3. Martinez pulled a grenade from his belt, removed the pin, and held it for a moment before tossing it up the remaining stairs. We pressed ourselves against the wall as the explosion rocked the stairwell. Then, without hesitation, Martinez charged up the steps, firing as he went. I was right behind him. There were 3 Germans. 2 were down from the grenade. The 3rd was raising his weapon when Martinez shot him. The machine gun was positioned at a window overlooking the village entrance. It had a perfect field of fire on the approach we'd taken. Martinez went to the window, waved his arm to signal to our unit that the position was secure. I checked the Germans to make sure they were no longer a threat. None of them had survived the grenade and our follow-up shots. Looking at their bodies, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that they couldn't kill any more of my comrades. A grim satisfaction at completing our mission. But also a strange sadness. These men were not much different from us. Young, far from home, fighting for a cause they may not fully understand. In another life, we might have been friends. But war doesn't allow for such reflections, not in the moment. Martinez and I secured the position, set up our own observation post, and prepared to support our unit's advance into the village. The rest of the company moved in, encountering sporadic resistance, but nothing like the organized defense we'd feared. By nightfall, the village was in American hands. We set up a command post in what had been the mayor's office, established defensive positions, and tended to our wounded. The lieutenant gathered us for a brief meeting. "Good work today," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over gunfire. "Especially Martinez and Miller. Taking out that machine gun probably saved a dozen lives or more." It was strange to be praised for killing, but that's the reality of war. What would be murder in civilian life becomes heroism in combat. It's a contradiction I've never fully reconciled. That night, as I tried to sleep in the hayloft of a barn at the edge of the village, I thought about Frank, about how he'd never see another sunrise, never taste his mother's cooking again, never marry his girl back home. I thought about the German soldiers in the church tower, wondered if they had families waiting for them, if someone would mourn them as I mourned Frank. These thoughts weren't conducive to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won out. My dreams were vivid, disturbing. I saw Frank, not as he had been on the beach, but as I remembered him from training, laughing, full of life. In the dream, he was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of waves crashing on a distant shore. The next few days blurred together. We pushed further inland, fighting through hedgerows, taking villages, losing men, gaining ground inch by bloody inch. Peterson stayed close to me, and I to him. We developed the instincts of veteran soldiers quickly. When to duck, when to run, when to fire, when to hold. Survival depended on these instincts. On our 5th day in Normandy, we were ordered to take a small crossroads about 3 miles from our current position. Intelligence reported German armor in the area, but our commanders believed we could secure the objective before the enemy tanks could respond. We moved out at dawn, advancing through terrain now familiar in its challenges. The hedgerows remained the biggest obstacle, each one potentially hiding an enemy ambush. Our unit had developed techniques for dealing with them, tossing grenades over before crossing, having one team provide cover while another moved forward. The morning was foggy, visibility limited to about 50 yards. This was both a blessing and a curse. The Germans couldn't see us as well, but we also couldn't see them until we were almost on top of them. About halfway to our objective, the point squad signaled for a halt. They'd spotted movement ahead. We all dropped to the ground, weapons ready. Through the fog, the shapes of German soldiers emerged, moving perpendicular to our line of advance. They hadn't seen us yet. Our lieutenant signaled for us to hold fire. The German patrol was larger than our unit, and engaging them might bring unwanted attention before we reached our objective. We lay motionless in the damp grass as the enemy passed within 30 yards of our position. Once they were gone, we continued our advance, more cautious now. The fog was beginning to lift as the morning sun grew stronger, which increased the risk of detection. We picked up the pace, hoping to reach the crossroads before the weather cleared completely. We were about half a mile from our objective when the first shell hit. It exploded in a field to our right, showering us with dirt and debris. Then another, closer this time. Someone shouted, "Take cover!" But there was precious little to be found in the open field. The third shell landed among us. The world exploded into chaos. I was thrown through the air, landing hard several yards away. My ears rang and my vision blurred. I couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine. The taste of blood filled my mouth. I tried to stand but couldn't. Looking down, I saw that my left leg was a mangled mess below the knee. The sight didn't immediately register as my own body. It seemed like something apart from me, something I was observing rather than experiencing. Then the pain hit, a white-hot fire that consumed everything. I cried out, though I couldn't hear my own voice. Men were running, firing, falling all around me. Through the haze of pain and confusion, I recognized Peterson kneeling beside me, his mouth moving, saying words I couldn't understand. He was trying to apply a tourniquet to my leg. I watched, detached, as he wrapped his belt around my thigh and pulled it tight. The pain intensified, but strangely, it helped clear my head. The ringing in my ears subsided enough that I could hear again. The crack of rifles, the thump of mortars, the shouts of men trying to organize a defense. "Tanks!" Someone was yelling. "German tanks coming from the east." Peterson looked up at the warning, then back at me. "I've got to get you out of here," he said, his young face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Can you move at all?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. With his help, I managed to get to my one good foot. He put my arm around his shoulders, taking my weight. Together, we began to hobble toward a drainage ditch about 50 yards away. It wasn't much cover, but it was better than lying in the open. Every step was agony. Blood soaked my torn pant leg, dripping onto the ground. I knew I was leaving a trail, but there was nothing to be done about it. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on staying conscious despite the pain and blood loss. We were about halfway to the ditch when I heard the distinctive sound of a tank's main gun firing. The shell hit somewhere behind us, close enough that we felt the concussion. Peterson stumbled and we both nearly fell. "Leave me," I gasped. "You can move faster without me." "Not happening," he grunted, adjusting his grip and pressing forward. "No one gets left behind, remember?" Another shell, closer this time. The explosion threw us both to the ground. I screamed as my injured leg hit the earth. For a moment, everything went gray, and I thought I might pass out. When my vision cleared, Peterson was picking himself up, seemingly unhurt. "Chunkin, come on," he said, reaching down to help me up again. "We're almost there." The tanks were visible now, German Panthers moving across the field toward our scattered unit. Our anti-tank weapons were opening up, trying to stop them. But the fog had given the enemy the element of surprise. We were outgunned and outpositioned. Peterson and I resumed our painful journey toward the ditch. It seemed to get further away with each step. The sound of machine gun fire grew closer. Bullets kicked up dirt around us. Peterson increased our pace, half carrying me now. "Almost there," he kept saying. "Just a little further." A burst of machine gun fire ripped across our path. I felt Peterson jerk and stumble. He tried to keep going, but his steps became uneven. Looking at him, I saw blood spreading across his chest. "Peterson," I gasped. You're hit." "I'm okay," he said, but his voice was tight with pain. "We're going to make it." We took a few more steps before his strength gave out. We collapsed together at the edge of the ditch, not quite making it to the meager safety it offered. Peterson was breathing in short, sharp gasps. The front of his uniform was now soaked with blood. "Go," he wheezed. "Get in." "The ditch." I shook my head. "Not without you." Using what strength I had left, I grabbed his webbing and began to pull both of us over the edge and down into the ditch. The effort sent waves of pain through my mangled leg, but adrenaline kept me going. Somehow we made it, rolling down the slight incline to land at the bottom. The ditch was about 4 feet deep, with stagnant water at the bottom. It smelled of rot and decay, but it provided some cover from the battle raging above. I pulled Peterson close, examining his wounds. He'd been hit multiple times across his torso. Even with my limited medical knowledge, I could tell the injuries were severe, possibly fatal. "Hold on," I told him, fumbling for the first aid kit on my belt. "I'll patch you up. A medic will be here soon." He tried to smile, but it was more of a grimace. "Don't lie to me, Miller. Not now." I swallowed hard, tears mixing with the dirt and blood on my face. "You're going to be fine," I insisted, though we both knew it wasn't true. With shaking hands, I applied sulfa powder to his wounds and wrapped them as best I could with the limited bandages in my kit. The dressings were quickly soaked through with blood. Peterson's face grew paler by the minute, his breathing more labored. My mother, he said, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. Remember what you promised. I'll write to her, I assured him. But you can tell her yourself when we get home. He shook his head slightly, then winced at the effort. Listen, he said, the picture? In my pocket. Take it. Send it back to her. It's all she has left of my father. I reached into his breast pocket and found a small, worn photograph of a man in a World War I uniform. The resemblance to Peterson was striking. The same serious eyes, the same determined set of the jaw. I'll make sure she gets it. I promised. He nodded, seemingly relieved. Then his eyes fixed on something over my shoulder. Something I couldn't see. A small smile touched his lips. Dad? He whispered. Then his body went slack, his eyes still open but seeing nothing. Peterson? I shook him gently, then more urgently. Peterson! No. But he was gone. Just like Frank. Just like so many others. Gone in an instant, leaving behind nothing but memories and a hole in the world where a living, breathing person used to be. I don't know how long I sat there in that ditch, holding Peterson's body, listening to the battle rage above us. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The pain in my leg had dulled to a throbbing ache, which I knew was a bad sign. I was probably going into shock from blood loss. The sounds of fighting gradually moved away. The German tanks must have broken through our lines and continued toward their objective. Our forces were either in retreat or had been overrun. Either way, I was alone now, wounded with a dead comrade, behind what were probably enemy lines. I knew I needed to move, to try to find my way back to American positions. But I couldn't bring myself to leave Peterson's body. Not yet. I closed his eyes and arranged his hands over his chest, trying to give him some dignity in death. Finally, necessity overcame sentiment. I had to try to save myself. Using my rifle as a makeshift crutch, I pulled myself up to the edge of the ditch and peered out. The field was littered with bodies, American and German alike. Abandoned equipment lay scattered across the churned earth. Smoke rose from several burning vehicles. No movement, no sign of friend or foe. The battle had moved on, leaving only its aftermath. I dragged myself out of the ditch, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through my injured leg. The tourniquet Peterson had applied had probably saved my life, but it couldn't be left on too long without risking the loss of the limb. I adjusted it, loosening it slightly, then tightening it again when the blood flow increased. Looking around, I tried to get my bearings. The sun was now high in the sky, the fog long gone. Based on its position, I determined that our lines should be to the west. That meant moving away from the crossroads back the way we had come. I began the painful process of dragging myself across the battlefield. My progress was painfully slow. Each yard felt like a mile. I used anything I could find for support. My rifle, fallen tree branches, even the bodies of the dead when there was nothing else. The day grew hotter and thirst became my constant companion. My canteen had been lost somewhere during the chaos of the shelling. I checked the bodies I passed for water, finding a few with canteens still attached to their belts. I tried not to think about who they had been, these men whose last resources were now sustaining me. By mid-afternoon, I'd made it perhaps half a mile. My strength was fading. The landscape swam before my eyes, and I knew I was reaching the limits of my endurance. I collapsed beside the body of a German soldier, no longer caring about the risk of being spotted by enemy patrols. As I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, I thought I heard voices. American voices. At first, I assumed it was a hallucination, my mind giving me what I most wanted to hear. But then rough hands were turning me over, and a face blocked out the sun. "This one's alive," someone called out. "Get a medic over here." A canteen was pressed to my lips, and I drank greedily, some of the water spilling down my chin. The face above me came into focus. A lieutenant from another company. "What unit are you with, soldier?" he asked. I tried to answer, but my voice was a raspy whisper. I had to try twice before the words came out. 116th Infantry, 29th Division. The lieutenant nodded. "You're way off course, son. What happened to your unit?" "Ambushed," I managed to say. "German tanks. We were scattered." More men gathered around. A medic knelt beside me, examining my leg with practiced hands. His expression told me what I already knew. It was bad. "We need to get him evacuated," the medic said to the lieutenant. "He's going to lose the leg if we don't get him to a field hospital soon." The lieutenant nodded. "Get him on a stretcher. We'll send him back with the next jeep." As they prepared to move me, I grabbed the lieutenant's sleeve. "Peterson," I said. "In a ditch, half a mile east. Need to recover his body. We'll send a detail," the lieutenant promised. but right now we need to take care of you." They lifted me onto a stretcher, the movement sending fresh agony through my leg. I must have passed out from the pain because the next thing I remember is being loaded into a Jeep. The vehicle bounced over the uneven ground, each jolt a fresh torture. I focused on staying conscious, on breathing through the pain. We reached a field hospital set up in what had once been a school. The scene was one of organized chaos. Wounded men everywhere, medics and nurses moving quickly between them, the air thick with the smells of blood, antiseptic, and death. I was assessed quickly by a doctor who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Shrapnel wounds to the left leg, severe tissue damage, possible arterial involvement. He dictated to a nurse. "Prep him for surgery." Things moved quickly after that. I was given morphine. Blessed relief flooding through me as the pain receded. As I drifted on the edge of consciousness, I heard the doctor continuing his assessment. "We'll try to save the leg, but I'm not optimistic. Blood loss is significant, and there's extensive muscle and nerve damage." I wanted to protest, to beg them to save my leg, but the morphine made it impossible to form the words. The last thing I remember before succumbing to the drug was the bright lights of the operating theater and the doctor's voice asking for instruments. When I woke, it was night. The ward was dimly lit, with nurses moving quietly among the beds. The pain in my leg was dulled but persistent. I lifted my head to look down at it, dreading what I might see, but relieved to find it still there, heavily bandaged but intact. A nurse noticed I was awake and came to my bedside. "Welcome back," she said, checking my pulse. "You've been out for quite a while." "My leg?" I asked, my throat dry and voice hoarse. "The doctor managed to save it," she said, "though it was touch and go for a while. You'll need more surgeries and there's a long recovery ahead, but with luck and hard work, you might walk again." It wasn't the most optimistic prognosis, but it was better than I had feared. "Thank you," I said. She smiled, patted my hand. "Get some rest now. You're going to need your strength." The next few days passed in a blur of pain, medication, and brief periods of consciousness. I learned that I was being sent back to England for further treatment. My war, it seemed, was over. On my last day at the field hospital, a chaplain visited me. He sat beside my bed, his manner gentle but direct. "Private Miller," he said, "I wanted to let you know that we recovered the body of Private Peterson. He'll be buried with honor in the American cemetery being established near here." Relief washed over me. "Thank you, Father." Did you find a photograph in his pocket of his father?" The chaplain nodded and reached into his pocket. "This was with his personal effects. I understand you promised to send it to his mother?" He handed me the worn photo. "Yes," I said, carefully taking it. "It was his last request." "I'll make sure you have the address before you're evacuated," the chaplain promised. "And if you'd like, I can include a letter from you with the official notification." I nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I'd like that very much." The next day, I was loaded onto an ambulance with several other wounded men and taken to a makeshift airfield. From there, we were flown to a hospital in England. The journey was uncomfortable, the pain in my leg flaring with every bump and movement of the aircraft. But I was alive. More than that, I had a purpose now, to fulfill my promise to Peterson, to make sure his mother knew how brave her son had been in his final moments. In England, I underwent several more surgeries. The doctors were able to save most of my leg, though they had to amputate part of my foot. I would walk with a limp for the rest of my life. But I would walk, something that had seemed impossible in that blood-soaked field in Normandy. During my recovery, I wrote to Peterson's mother as promised. I told her how her son had saved my life, how he had fought bravely until the end, how his last thoughts had been of her. I enclosed the photograph of his father, explaining its significance. It was the hardest letter I've ever written, but also one of the most important. I also wrote to Frank's family, though I had less to tell them about his final moments. I simply said that he had died quickly, without suffering, which I hoped was true. I mentioned our friendship, the small kindnesses he had shown me, the things he had told me about his dreams for after the war. It felt insufficient, but it was all I could offer. As my recovery progressed, the war continued without me. We received news of the Allied advance across France, the liberation of Paris, the push toward Germany. Each victory was celebrated in the hospital, though for many of us, the joy was tempered by the knowledge of what those victories cost in human lives. By winter, I was able to walk short distances with the aid of a cane. The doctors were pleased with my progress, but made it clear that I would never return to combat. In January 1945, I received orders that I was being sent home. My war was officially over. The journey back to the States was long and uncomfortable. I traveled on a hospital ship surrounded by other wounded men. Some had injuries far worse than mine. Missing limbs, severe burns, psychological trauma that left them staring blankly for hours on end. I tried to help where I could, reading to those whose eyes were damaged, writing letters for those who could no longer hold a pen, simply listening to those who needed to talk. We arrived in New York Harbor on a clear February morning. As the ship passed the Statue of Liberty, men crowded the decks, many with tears in their eyes. For some, it was their first glimpse of home in years. For others like me, it was a bittersweet homecoming, marred by the knowledge that so many others would never make this journey. From New York, I was transferred to a veterans hospital in Virginia, closer to my home. My parents came to visit as soon as they could. My mother cried when she saw me, though she tried to hide it. My father, a man of few words at the best of times, simply gripped my shoulder so tightly it almost hurt. "We're proud of you, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. So damn proud. I was discharged from the hospital in May, just as the war in Europe was ending. I returned to my parents' home in Culpeper, a decorated veteran at 23, with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star for the action at the church, and a lifetime of memories I wished I could forget. Adjusting to civilian life was harder than I had expected. The quiet of rural Virginia, once so comforting, now seemed oppressive after the constant noise of war. I would wake in the night, convinced I was back in that drainage ditch with Peterson, or on the beach with Frank's body. My mother would find me on the porch at dawn, unable to sleep, staring at the sunrise as if it might contain answers to questions I couldn't articulate. In August, Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was finally completely over. The town held a celebration in the square, with music and dancing and speeches by local officials. I attended, standing at the back of the crowd, my cane keeping me steady. People thanked me for my service, called me a hero. I accepted their gratitude awkwardly, knowing that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. Life went on. I used the GI Bill to attend college studying engineering. The discipline and precision of mathematics provided a structure my mind craved after the chaos of war. I graduated with honors and found a job with a construction firm in Richmond. In time, the nightmares became less frequent. The sounds of backfiring cars no longer sent me diving for cover. I learned to walk without a cane for short distances, though my limp remained. I dated occasionally, though I found it difficult to connect with women who couldn't understand what I had experienced. Then in 1950, I received a letter from a woman named Helen Peterson, Peterson's mother. She had kept the photograph I'd returned to her, she wrote, and my letter about her son's bravery. She was planning a visit to the East Coast and asked if we might meet. She wanted to hear more about her son's final days from someone who had been there. We arranged to meet at a cafe in Richmond. I arrived early, nervous about facing this woman whose son had died saving my life. When she entered, I recognized her immediately. She had the same serious eyes as her son, the same determined set of the jaw. Our conversation was difficult at first, both of us unsure how to navigate the complex emotions between us. But gradually we found our footing. I told her everything I could remember about her son, his courage, his humor, his friendship during those brief, intense days in Normandy. She, in turn, shared stories of his childhood, showed me more photographs, painted a picture of the boy who had become the man I briefly knew. He called out to his father at the end. I told her, hesitating but feeling she deserved the truth. He seemed at peace. She nodded, tears in her eyes but a small smile on her lips. His father died at Belleau Wood in the First War. David, my son, always wanted to live up to his example. I think he would have been pleased to know he died as his father did, serving his country. We parted with a hug, both of us crying without shame. It was a cathartic experience, one that helped heal wounds I hadn't fully acknowledged. Helen and I continued to correspond after that. Our letters a bridge between two people connected by loss, but also by the memory of someone we had both loved in different ways. Life continued its forward march. I married in 1953, a nurse named Sarah who understood trauma in ways most civilians couldn't. We had 2 children, a boy and a girl. I named my son David after Peterson, though I never told him the full story until he was older. The years rolled by. I built a career, raised my family, grew older. The war receded in my memory, though it never truly left me. Certain sounds, smells, or images could still transport me back to those beaches and fields of Normandy. But the episodes became less frequent, less overwhelming. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, I returned to Normandy with Sarah. The trip was emotionally challenging but necessary. I visited the American cemetery, where row upon row of white crosses and stars of David marked the final resting places of those who had fallen. I found Peterson's grave and stood before it in silence, remembering the young man who had saved my life at the cost of his own. I also walked on Omaha Beach, now peaceful and beautiful, with no sign of the carnage I remembered. Local children played in the surf, tourists sunbathed on the sand. It seemed impossible that this tranquil place had once been a scene of such horror and heroism. Standing there watching the waves roll in, I thought about all the men who had died on these shores, about Frank lying face down in the sand, about Peterson bleeding out in a drainage ditch, about countless others whose names I never knew. They had given everything, their very lives, for a cause they believed in, and I had survived. Not unscathed, not unchanged, but alive. I had lived to see the peace they had died to secure. I had married, had children, built a life. Was it fair? No number, but I had tried to make it meaningful, to live in a way that honored their sacrifice. As the sun began to set over the English Channel, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, I felt a strange sensation. Not peace exactly, but a kind of acceptance. The war had shaped me, had taken parts of me I could never get back, but it had also given me a perspective on life that few were granted. I knew how quickly it could all end, how precious each moment was. I knew the depths of human cruelty, but also the heights of courage and self-sacrifice. I knew what it meant to be saved by another's selflessness, to be the recipient of a gift that could never be repaid except by living well. These were hard-won insights purchased at a terrible price, but they were mine, and they had made me who I was. For better or worse, the war would always be part of me. That night, in a small hotel overlooking the beach, I dreamed of Frank and Peterson. Not as they had died, but as they had lived, young, vibrant, full of possibilities. In the dream, we walked together along the beach, talking and laughing as if the intervening decades had never happened. As dawn broke, I sat by the window, watching the first light touch the waters where so many had fought and died. I felt a presence beside me, though Sarah still slept in the bed behind me. It wasn't frightening, the sense of not being alone. Instead, it was comforting, as if old friends had stopped by to say hello. "I've tried to live a good life," I whispered to the empty room. "I hope it's been enough." There was no answer, of course. Just the sound of waves on the shore and the distant cry of seagulls. But as I sat there watching the new day begin, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a burden I had carried for 40 years without fully realizing its presence. I didn't know then that this was just the beginning of a much stranger journey, one that would lead me to question everything I thought I knew about life and death. I couldn't have imagined that the most profound part of my war experience was yet to come. But on that quiet morning in Normandy, as the sun rose over the beach where I had nearly died 4 decades earlier, I felt something shift within me. A door opening to possibilities I had never considered, a preparation for what was to come, and what came next would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened that morning in Normandy in 1984, I need to go back. Back to 1944, back to the moment everything changed for me. I never told anyone the full story of what happened after I was wounded. Not my doctors, not my parents, not even Sarah. How could I? In those days, men didn't talk about such things. Veterans were expected to come home, put the war behind them, and get on with life. Those who couldn't, who talked about strange experiences or struggled with what we now call PTSD, were often viewed with suspicion or pity. So I kept it to myself. For 40 years, I carried it alone. But now I think it's time to tell the truth. The truth is, I died that day in Normandy. Not clinically, not in any way a doctor would recognize or record, but I died all the same. It happened after Peterson and I made it to that drainage ditch. After he was hit, after he took his last breath. I mentioned earlier that I sat there with his body, not knowing how long I remained in that ditch. What I didn't say was what happened during that time. The pain in my leg had become a distant thing, as if it belonged to someone else. I was losing blood quickly, despite the tourniquet. The world around me began to fade, colors washing out, sounds becoming muffled. I remember thinking, with strange clarity, so this is how it ends. I wasn't afraid, which surprised me. Throughout the war, I had dreaded this moment, had seen the fear in other men's eyes as they faced their mortality. But now that it was happening to me, I felt only a profound acceptance. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. I tried to stay conscious, tried to fight, but it was like trying to swim against a powerful current. Eventually, I stopped struggling and let it take me. And then I was no longer in the ditch. The transition was seamless, with no sense of movement or passage. One moment I was lying beside Peterson's body, and the next I was standing with no pain, no wounded leg, on the battlefield. But it wasn't the battlefield as I had last seen it. The bodies were gone. The churned earth, the abandoned equipment, the blood-soaked ground, all gone. Instead, the field was as it might have been before the war. Tall grass swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. Wildflowers dotting the landscape with splashes of color. I looked down at myself, expecting to see my torn, bloodied uniform. Instead, I was wearing clean, unmarked khakis. My leg was whole, uninjured. I felt a lightness in my body, as if gravity had loosened its hold on me. "James," the voice came from behind me. I turned and saw Frank Wilson standing there, looking exactly as he had the night before the landing. Young, whole, his eyes clear and bright. "Frank?" My voice sounded strange to my ears, as if it were coming from both inside and outside of me simultaneously. He smiled, that crooked smile I'd come to know during our training. "Good to see you, buddy. But you're..." I couldn't finish the sentence. "Dead?" He nodded. "Yeah, so are you. Or at least you're right on the edge." I shook my head, trying to make sense of what was happening. Is this a hallucination? From blood loss? Frank shrugged. "Does it feel like a hallucination?" It didn't. Despite the impossibility of what was happening, it felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. Colors were more vibrant, sounds more clear. Even the air seemed to hold a quality I had never noticed before, as if it were alive, pulsing with energy. "Come on," Frank said, turning and walking away. "There are others who want to see you." I followed him across the field, noticing that the landscape was changing subtly as we walked. The open ground gave way to a gentle slope, and at the top of this rise stood a group of people. As we approached, I recognized some of them. Soldiers from our unit who had been killed during the landing or in the days that followed. And there, at the front of the group, was Peterson. He stepped forward as we reached them, extending his hand as if we were meeting for the first time. When I took it, a surge of emotion passed between us. Gratitude, friendship, understanding, more intense than any I had felt in life. "Thank you," I said, though the words seemed wholly inadequate. Peterson smiled. "No thanks needed. We were soldiers. We looked out for each other." I looked around at the assembled men, all of whom regarded me with expressions of warmth and welcome. What is this place?" I asked. "That's complicated," said an older man I didn't recognize, stepping forward from the group. He wore a World War I uniform, and I realized with a start that it was Peterson's father. Most people have a different experience of this. Transition. You're seeing it through the lens of your most recent memories. "Transition to what?" I asked, though I think I already knew the answer. "To what comes next," he said simply. Frank put his hand on my shoulder. "But that's not for you." "Not yet." Before I could ask what he meant, the scene changed again. The field, the hill, even my fellow soldiers faded away. In their place was a vast, limitless space filled with light. Not blinding, not painful to look at, but all-encompassing, as if the light itself was a living presence. Within this light, I sensed rather than saw a presence. It seemed to surround me, to fill every part of me, to know me completely, every thought, every fear, every dream I'd ever had. And rather than feeling exposed or judged, I felt totally accepted, totally loved. Words are poor tools to describe what happened next. It wasn't communication as we understand it, with words and sentences and pauses for breath. It was more like an instantaneous understanding, a download of knowledge and wisdom that bypassed language entirely. I understood that this presence, God, the universe, the source, whatever name you want to give it, was in everything and everyone. That the divides we create between ourselves, nation, race, religion, even the boundary between life and death, were illusions, artificial constructs that masked a deeper unity. I understood that each life, no matter how brief or seemingly insignificant, was a unique and irreplaceable part of a vast pattern, a cosmic tapestry whose full design was beyond human comprehension. I understood that love, not the greeting card version, but something deeper and more fundamental, was the underlying reality of existence, the force that bound everything together, that gave meaning to joy and purpose to suffering. And I understood that I was being given a choice. I could stay in this state of perfect understanding, perfect peace, or I could return to the broken body lying in that drainage ditch in Normandy. Why would I go back? I asked, though not with words. The answer came not as a command or even an argument, but as a gentle reminder of connections still unresolved, of promises still to be kept, of a journey not yet complete. I saw flashes of a future that could be. My parents greeting me at the hospital, a woman I hadn't yet met but would come to love, children who did not yet exist but would carry part of me forward into the world. And I saw something else too, the task that would be mine if I chose to return, to carry a message back across the boundary, to speak of what I had seen and felt, to bear witness to a reality beyond the material world that most of us spend our lives navigating. It wasn't presented as a burden or an obligation, but as an opportunity, a chance to be a bridge between worlds, to bring back a fragment of the understanding I had been granted. How long did this experience last? In that realm, time as we know it didn't exist. It could have been seconds or centuries, but eventually I made my choice. I'll go back, I said again without words, and immediately the light began to recede. The sense of perfect knowledge, of unity with all things began to fade. I wanted to hold on to it, to memorize every detail, but it was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The more tightly I grasped, the more quickly it slipped away. The last thing I remember is a kind of farewell, not sad but reassuring, promising that what I had experienced wasn't being taken from me forever, only set aside until it was truly time for me to cross over permanently. Then pain, overwhelming, all-consuming pain, radiating from my leg throughout my entire body. The smell of blood and dirt and gunpowder, the cold wetness of the ditch beneath me, Peterson's lifeless body beside me. I had returned. What I described earlier about dragging myself across the battlefield, being found by soldiers from another unit, my evacuation and treatment, all of that happened after my return. But it wasn't the same me who had left that ditch. I came back changed in ways that would take me years to fully understand. The immediate physical reality was dire enough to push the experience to the back of my mind. Survival became my focus. Getting through the next minute, the next hour, the next procedure. The doctors later told me that my survival was remarkable. I had lost so much blood that by all rights I should have died in that field or during transport. Someone up there must be looking out for you, one nurse told me as she changed my bandages. If only she knew. It wasn't until I was recovering in England, with the immediate danger past, that I began to process what had happened to me. At first I tried to rationalize it. Near-death experiences weren't widely discussed in the 1940s, but they weren't unknown either. I told myself it had been a hallucination caused by trauma and blood loss, my brain's way of coping with the imminent prospect of death. But there were aspects of the experience that such explanations couldn't account for. The sense of hyper-reality, the quality of the light, the complete absence of fear or pain, the profound understanding that had come to me, these didn't fit neatly into the category of hallucination. And then there were the specifics I couldn't have known. During my experience, I had seen Peterson's father in his World War I uniform, yet I had never seen a photograph of him, had no idea what he looked like. When Peterson's mother showed me that photograph years later, the resemblance to the man I had seen was exact, down to details like the way his collar was arranged and a small scar above his right eyebrow. There were other validations too. In my vision, I had seen a woman I would come to love, though her face was indistinct. When I met Sarah 5 years after the war, I knew her immediately, though we had never met before. There was a sense of recognition, of homecoming, that transcended our actual introduction. During my recovery, I spoke to a chaplain at the hospital, cautiously at first, not revealing the full extent of what I had experienced, but asking questions about theology and the afterlife. He was a kind man, more interested in providing comfort than enforcing doctrine, and he encouraged me to see my survival as a gift, regardless of what had accompanied it. The mysteries of life and death are beyond our complete understanding, he told me. If you've been granted a glimpse beyond the veil, consider it a blessing, not a burden. But it was a burden in some ways. How do you return to normal life after experiencing what I had? How do you concern yourself with mortgage payments and office politics when you've touched something so far beyond the mundane? The message I had been given, about the unity underlying all existence, about love as the fundamental reality, wasn't easy to integrate into post-war American society. The 1950s weren't exactly a time of spiritual exploration. The focus was on material progress, on putting the war behind us and building a prosperous future. So I kept quiet. I focused on the practical, finishing my education, starting my career, courting and marrying Sarah, raising our children. I became, to all outward appearances, a typical American success story. The veteran who overcame his war injuries to build a good life. But inwardly, I lived with a constant awareness of something more. It wasn't dramatic or disruptive. I didn't hear voices or see visions, but rather a quiet certainty that what we call reality is just the surface of a much deeper truth. This awareness expressed itself in small ways. I found myself drawn to help others, particularly those who were suffering or marginalized. In the segregated South of the 1950s and 60s, I quietly supported civil rights efforts, seeing in them an echo of the universal connection I had experienced. I became less materialistic, less concerned with status or possessions. I took my children camping, wanting them to feel the wonder of the natural world. I read widely in philosophy, religion, and emerging scientific theories that seemed to point toward a more interconnected view of reality. And occasionally, usually when I was alone in nature or in the quiet early hours of the morning, I would feel echoes of that perfect light, that all-encompassing love. These moments were brief but intensely precious to me, reminders that what I had experienced was real, not a trauma-induced fantasy. Sarah, perceptive as she was, knew there was something different about me. "You carry a stillness with you," she once told me. "Even when everything is chaos around you, there's a quiet center that nothing seems to touch." It was as close as I could come to describing it to her, until much later in our marriage when I finally shared the full story. She listened without interruption, without judgment, and when I finished, she took my hands in hers. "I always knew there was something," she said, "something you carried that made you different from other men I've known." "Do you think I'm crazy?" I asked her. She shook her head. "I think you're the sanest person I know." Her acceptance was a turning point for me. If Sarah, practical, no-nonsense Sarah, could accept my experience, perhaps I didn't need to keep it entirely to myself anymore. I began cautiously to share aspects of my story with others. A fellow veteran struggling with grief, a neighbor facing terminal illness, my son when he went through a period of existential questioning in college. Not the full account, but enough to convey the central message. That love underlies everything, that we are all connected in ways our ordinary perception can't grasp, that death is a transition, not an end. Some responded with skepticism, others with interest, a few with their own stories of transcendent moments. I learned to recognize the people who were open to such discussions and to respect the boundaries of those who weren't. As the decades passed, the cultural climate began to shift. The rigid conformity of the 1950s gave way to the spiritual experimentation of the 1960s and 70s. Books about near-death experiences became bestsellers. Scientists began studying such phenomena rather than dismissing them outright. I followed these developments with interest, seeing in them a validation of what I had experienced so many years earlier. But I remained private about my own experience, sharing it only with those who seemed to need the perspective it might offer. Then came the 40th anniversary of D-Day and our return to Normandy. Standing on that beach, I felt a strange convergence of time. The young soldier I had been, the old man I had become, and something beyond both, something eternal that had been revealed to me in that drainage ditch. The weight that lifted from me that morning wasn't just the burden of survivor's guilt or traumatic memory. It was the last of my doubt, the last of my hesitation. It was time to speak more openly, to fulfill the purpose for which I had been sent back. I began writing down my full experience, not just the external events of the war, but the inner journey as well. The words came easily, as if they had been waiting all these years to be released. I didn't worry about how it would be received or whether people would believe me. I simply told the truth as I had lived it. When I finished, I showed it to Sarah. "What should I do with this?" I asked her. She read it carefully, took a day to think about it, then said, "Share it. There are people who need to hear this." So I did. Not widely at first, just with a veterans group I belonged to, then with a small spiritual community that had formed in our town. The response was powerful. Men and women approached me after hearing my story, some with tears in their eyes sharing how it had touched something in them, answered questions they had been afraid to ask, or given them hope they had lost. One woman, the widow of a Vietnam veteran who had struggled with PTSD until his death, hugged me and whispered, "Thank you. I've always believed he found peace, but now I know it." A young man recently diagnosed with a serious illness told me my story had taken away his fear of death. "Not completely," he added with a small smile, "but enough that I can focus on living the time I have left." As word spread, I was invited to speak to larger groups, hospice organizations, church congregations, even a symposium on near-death studies at a nearby university. I didn't seek out these opportunities, but when they came, I accepted them as part of the task I had been given. Some skeptics questioned my story, of course. They suggested that memory is unreliable, that trauma can produce convincing hallucinations, that I was misremembering or embellishing events that had happened decades earlier. I didn't argue with them. What I had experienced was beyond proof or disproof by ordinary means. Either it resonated with people, connected with something they already knew at some level, or it didn't. My job wasn't to convince the skeptics, but to speak to those who were ready to hear. As I entered my 70s, then my 80s, I became less concerned with people's reactions and more focused on simply bearing witness. The message I had been given wasn't complicated, that love is the fundamental reality, that we are all connected in ways our everyday consciousness rarely perceives, that death is not the end, but a transition. This message wasn't unique to me, of course. Mystics, philosophers, and spiritual teachers have been saying similar things for thousands of years. What was unique was the context, that this profound spiritual truth had come to me not in a monastery or a temple, but in the mud and blood of a battlefield, in one of humanity's darkest hours. There was something powerful about that conjunction, that in the midst of war, where human division and hatred are at their most extreme, I had been shown a vision of ultimate unity and love. It suggested that even in our worst moments, even when we are furthest from our true nature, the deeper reality remains, waiting to be recognized. As I approach the end of my own life, I'm 95 now, and while my health is reasonable for my age, I harbor no illusions about immortality. I find myself reflecting on the full arc of my experience. I went to war as a typical young American man of my generation, idealistic, naive, unprepared for what I would face. I came home physically damaged but spiritually awakened, carrying a truth that would take me decades to fully integrate and express. The message I was given has shaped every aspect of my life since that day in Normandy. It changed how I understood myself, how I related to others, how I approached joy and suffering alike. It gave me a perspective that time has only deepened and clarified. If there's one thing I would want people to take from my story, it's this. The division and conflict we experience in this world, as real and painful as they are, exist against the backdrop of a more fundamental unity. The love that connects all things isn't just a poetic ideal, but the actual fabric of reality, temporarily obscured by our limited perception, but never truly absent. I saw this truth most clearly in what many would consider the most unlikely of circumstances. Lying wounded on a battlefield, watching a friend die, my own life slipping away. If it can be found there, it can be found anywhere. I don't know exactly what awaits me when I cross over permanently. The details of that other realm seem to fade as I return to ordinary consciousness, like a dream that seems vitally important in the moment, but slips away upon waking. But I know this much, I am not afraid. Whatever comes next, I have glimpsed enough to know that it is not to be feared but welcomed when the time is right. And when that time comes, I believe I'll be met by those who went before me, by Frank and Peterson, by my parents, by Sarah who left me 5 years ago. Not because of some sentimental notion that heaven is a reunion with loved ones, but because I experienced directly that the connections between souls transcend physical existence. Until then, I continue to share my story when opportunities arise, to bear witness to what I saw and felt and understood in those moments between life and death. Not to convince or convert, but simply to offer another perspective, another possibility to those who might be ready to consider it. In the end, each of us must make our own journey, must find our own way to reconcile the material reality we can see and touch with the spiritual dimensions that lie beyond our ordinary senses. My experience is just one data point, one glimpse through a briefly open door, but it's a glimpse that transformed my life, that gave meaning to my survival when so many others died, that provided a foundation for everything that followed. And if sharing it offers even a fraction of that perspective to others, then my return from that drainage ditch in Normandy will have served its purpose. The message I brought back is simple. Love is the foundation. Connection is real. Death is not the end. Everything else is detail.